union voters, why both campaigns see union votes as a key to winning in swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. We'll get the latest from Detroit. Then, how the issue of crime is playing out in the swing states. A closer look at how voters perceive crime versus what stats say about the crime rate. Plus, how the most recent census has reshaped the electoral maps in many of our swing states, and why population shifts could be a big deal in a close election.
Oh, those
I'm Essie
illegal
Cup, and with
aliens.
63 days left until this election, this is Battleground.
And each and every one
That
of
was
you,
the Democrats'
thank you for the
plan
privilege
all
of walking
along.
that picket line with you last year. Thank you for allowing us to lift up our voices. And in Minnesota, the work that you did, it didn't just benefit UAW workers, it benefited all workers.
Tim Walz making
Yeah.
his pitch to auto workers in Michigan. Both campaigns are making multiple campaign stops aimed at working class Americans. In 3 of our swing states, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, that means union voters, with nearly 15% of the workforce in each state comprised of union members. That's a lot of potential votes. For more on the swing state battle for union voters, I'm joined by Todd Spangler, who covers politics for the Detroit Free Press. Todd, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
It's no accident, Todd, that Kamala Harris will be in Detroit on this Labor Day courting union voters. What is her pitch to union voters so far in this campaign, and do you think it's working?
The pitch is pretty clear. First of all, it's to continue the pro-union agenda that the Biden administration has had since it came in, and pushing for more expansion of organizing rights and walking the picket line. Biden becoming the first sitting president to ever walk a picket line before with the UAW. Another part of this is trying to remind union members that the Democratic top of the ticket looks more like them with Tim Walz and with some of Harris's working class background than the top of the Republican ticket. Finally, I think the big selling point here is just the level of enthusiasm that you're seeing with Democratic voters overall for the Harris campaign versus that lack of that enthusiasm for Biden before.
And tied to the Teamsters Union, which has a robust membership, we remember that their president spoke at the RNC and he was sort of snubbed by the DNC. Do you still expect the Teamsters to endorse Harris, or is that up for grabs?
I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Teamsters don't endorse in this race. Some of these other industrial unions have clearly moved ahead and just embracing Harris, embracing the Democratic ticket. But for the Teamsters, that's a little harder because I think they've got a larger part of their membership that is a little more conservative and wants to support Trump.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Teachers' unions also make up a reliable voting bloc in most of our swing states, and they've traditionally backed Democrats. Is that still the case?
Absolutely, without question, 100%. I mean, not 100% of the vote, but I mean, it's yes. There's the teachers' unions are absolutely going to be a big part of the Democrat push in the fall. And again, a big reason for that is not just that the Democrats have aligned themselves with the teachers' unions for decades now, but that, again, Harris gives them a chance, or at least a feeling of a chance to win that they didn't have with Biden.
Yeah.
And that enthusiasm is going to explode, especially among women. And you see a lot more women in teachers' unions than you do in some of these other unions we're talking about.
Yeah, good point. Finally, Todd, we know that union membership has been on the decline over a generation. How would you describe the state of labor, especially in some of our key swing states?
Yeah, I mean, actually longer than a generation, right? I mean, it's been declining for probably 20 years, 30 years. Been dropping sometimes precipitously and sometimes, a little.
Nobody wants to get their hands dirty anymore.
That said, in terms of public opinion of unions, it's way up. I've seen a Gallup poll here within the last week or so that suggests that 70% of people in the U.S. have a favorable opinion of unions. That's higher than it's been since the 60s. And there have been some wins. The UAW had a successful strike against the Detroit automakers. The railroads had a successful strike. The Writers Guild came out of their strike.
Right.
There have been a couple of job actions that have paid off, and that comes after the real gains that workers began to see post-pandemic. And as that started to change, you saw a lot of union leaders who did not want to go back, and we're not going to go back. And I think that's what's driving some of this. So you do see more public opinion in favor of unions than it had been for decades, but that hasn't translated yet into
membership.
Actual more union.
Yeah. Todd Spangler with the Detroit Free Press. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, is crime on the rise, or do we just feel that way? How that issue is playing out in our swing states. Battleground will be right back.
I think the auto workers are going to
overwhelmingly for Trump because they realize that we need a good business leader, and a good business leader creates jobs.
The auto workers tend to, at this stage, be more Republican.
I think the Democrats do represent working people in this country. I think Joe Biden's record and Kamala Harris with him, their
All that
record in
inflation.
supporting working people is very strong.
Why is it important to have a skilled attorney handle your interests? The way he was raised, or believing that men provide and they don't struggle. But we all struggle. I want to show emotion to my kids. I want them to know when I'm happy. I want them to know when I'm sad. And I want them to see me working through things.
Kamala Harris has presided over a 43% increase in violent crime. These are government numbers, by the way, including 58% increase in rape, 89% increase in aggravated assault, and 56% increase in robbery.
Welcome back to Battleground. Crime and public safety rank as important issues in all 7 of our swing states, something the Trump campaign highlights frequently during his Battleground visits. But in many of our swing states, violent crime is actually down. Take Phoenix, for example. In a recent deep dive on crime from Axios, they point out that homicides have decreased by 32%, as well as a drop in other crimes like rape and aggravated assault. But in many of our battleground big cities, residents don't perceive crime to be down, and therein lies the problem for our candidates. Russell Contreras is the senior race and justice reporter for Axios and the author of the Axios Latino newsletter. Russell, good to have you here.
Thanks, SC. How you doing?
Good. So first of all, terrific reporting on this issue. Let's start with how people feel about crime versus actual crime statistics. Why do we often have such a disconnect between how we feel and the real crime rates?
People can look at the stats of crime, whether they come from the city, the federal government, or a nonprofit organization, and not feel that's accurate depiction. And the reason why is there's violent crime and then there are property crime.
Yeah.
So while police may say, look, violent crime is going down on these categories, people may see a rise in property crime, that is auto thefts, burglaries. And so they don't necessarily differentiate the two. They'll say, look, I'm hearing my car got broken into the other day, my neighbor's car got... Crime is still a problem because of the opiate crisis. And so they'll connect the two. But in general, what we're seeing is a steady decline in violent crime overall. And that doesn't necessarily dent the perception of how people feel safe in their own communities.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't feel safe walking around at night in a city like Philadelphia, where I am, or New York, or DC, the numbers don't really, impact you as much as that feeling that you are unsafe. I'll point out a number of high-profile Democratic mayors and AGs lost their re-elections over the past few years because voters thought they were soft on crime. How worrisome should that be for Kamala Harris?
It should be worrisome because it shows that regardless of policies, regardless of the numbers, it's all about perception. It's all about narrative. So Kamala Harris does have a history. We did some investigating of her stats and her record as AG. What we did find is when she first came into office as Attorney General, violent crime did go down across the state. Now, she has very limited pull as Attorney General, but she could institute policies and so forth. So she does have a record at fighting violent crime. She also wrote a book that often gets overlooked in 2009 when she was a relatively unknown district attorney in San Francisco, where she talked about restorative justice. And she actually took to task the left and the right about fighting crime, saying, we do look at this a different way. Locking them up, throwing away the key isn't going to solve the problem, but also not holding people accountable if they do break crimes. If they have sort of addiction, held them accountable for that crime, but put them in a program where they don't repeat. They're not repeat offenders. She was, at the time, very different and very forward-thinking at the time. She has not given us a clue where she would do differently, but if we look at the record, shows some intrigue there.
Interesting, yeah. And what I know, speaking to voters, is they just don't want to be told that crime isn't real. In Arizona, let's go over to the other ticket. Donald Trump
They don't
talks a lot
talk
about
about
crime
the
and immigration, essentially
inmates
linking the
being
two.
held
But is that how voters see it?
past their release dates.
Voters may see that because of the way it's framed, but the stats and the narrative tell a different story. If you live along the border, whether it's South Texas, the border towns in Arizona or even in California, New Mexico, crime in these border towns is very low, especially violent crime. When you compare, say, the crime stats of border towns with the same size city in the interior, it's vastly different. I looked at numbers, say, like in 2020. I looked at the murder rate in, say, El Paso, Texas. It was 4%. If you consider El Paso as the same size of Memphis, the murder rate there was 44%.
Wow.
Largely different. McAllen, Texas, 2%. Yeah. Kansas City, Kansas, 36%. Del Rio, 3%. Lima, Ohio, same size city, 30%. Yeah. So the numbers don't add up. It seems like the perception is immigrants create crime. That's not the case. Now, you can point to individual cases where an undocumented person may have committed a crime, a horrendous crime, and that gets blown up. But that's just as unfair of me to saying, a dude from Appalachia committing a crime in Linden, Tennessee. Therefore, we should ban all Appalachians. It's not the same. It's not fair.
Right. I mean, we know that politics is perception, so this will continue to be an issue that both candidates just have to wrestle with in their communications with voters. Russell Contreras from Axios. Terrific reporting, Russell. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
For more on all of this, visit us at battlegroundnews.com or click on the QR code here. You can sign up for our newsletter, download our interactive swing state map, and find our social media links. And if you miss an episode, that's all right. You can catch up on YouTube or through our podcast.
Looks like you described it briefly earlier. You're basically the money follows the person, doesn't go into just a big pot. Is that the idea?
Right. Okay. So we've had situations like this already. Okay. We look into what's happened in the school choice movement. It's been years, and I've been working in those years, 30 years of trying to get to the reality that the Supreme Court has just given, that we can send our children to schools parents want. Of course, we have to battle now in the states to get that, but the Supreme Court ruled that it's not unconstitutional for money to follow children to schools parents want. And that has been a dilemma, especially from the progressive left forever, because unions are involved and they want to keep the one-size-fits-all educational apparatus so that they can keep themselves flush. It's the same kind of scenario, money following workers to a place they wanted to retire. But in order to do that, if you're very on the lower end of the economic scale, where do you get that money? Where do you get that money to say, I'm going to invest in my future? Now, most Americans have that opportunity because you can, perhaps not shop as much, not go out as much, and start saving and investing. But the poor, those that are under $25,000 a year, those that are trapped in our most at-risk communities around the country, there's just not that income available. However, there's a pot over here that they are paying 6.2% of their money. 6.2% of the boss has to match it, and they send it to the IRS. They do not send it to a trust fund. People have bought this idea that there's some big pot that congressional leaders have just been dipping into and stealing from us. No, there's never been such a trust fund. The Supreme Court ruled twice. It's a tax. It goes into the general revenues. We allocate some over here to Social Security. They send out checks to anyone that turns 65 or whenever, you decide that you're going to retire. Some go 62, some go 67. Now they're trying to talk you into stay longer, get closer to your death age because we don't have any money. So they're coming up with all kind of ways to try to convince people that they should postpone retirement. And that type of scenario just cannot last over time, especially with fewer children. Did I mention that we have fewer children? Did I mention that in less than 14 years, all the data is in that we will have more people over 65 than under 18? We'll have more people in this country over 65 than under 18 in just 14 years. That system can't sustain.
There is definitely that huge demographic shift with people having less children for all sorts of reasons.
For all sorts of reasons, people have decided to do this in their lives, and we all have opportunity to make those types of choices. But then it begs the question, should we have ourselves in a situation where government then has us in a one-size-fits-all, any type of scenario? We don't just argue at CURE against what we're doing on Social Security and wanting private and personal accounts. but we also argue this on welfare programs. I mean, all of our welfare programs, our so-called real safety net programs, are built on that same model, one size fits all. I lived in that before I got my degree and started my own business and then began to work in social policy. I had believed all the lies of the left, that my life was whatever I wanted it to be, and I ended up on welfare. We can go into all the details of that, but the rules were don't work, don't save, don't get married. And these rules are one size fits all, and over time, they do not work for anyone. And that's why we have pockets now of very, very broken communities, 8,700 of them, 20% of our zip codes, because we have concentrated poverty in those communities. Everything there, government controls and owns.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Basically, you're telling me that
Harris
the
Biden
incentive
administration
structures
done
are set up
anything to
to
help them?
have people not get out of that situation. So maybe just explain that to me.
You want a government house? Don't get married. You want to live in a housing project? Don't have a job. Come on.
But do people really want to live in those places?
Not really. I mean, over time, you can get on this treadmill, if you will. And if you're relatively poor and the society says, well, we're going to help you, but we're not going to help you personally. We're going to help you through a one-size-fits-all government apparatus. Then you go in to apply for that apparatus, and the next thing you know, you have to start decreasing your life. You have to drain your life. In order to get on Medicaid, you have to make sure that you have no investment in your health plans. In order to get on welfare, you have to make sure that you have no investment in any place, including in income. If you work in a job, they're going to take what you made on that job and put it back into the coffers. If you're on a food stamp program, you have certain requirements. They're called means tests, and every government program has those means tests, but the means tests are negative. They severely impact the poor. That's why they're trapped. And now it's generational, because once you get in the system, it's incredibly difficult to get out, because every time you try to move yourself upward, you're penalized by the very system that says they want to help you.
What do you mean the means test is negative?
The means, don't work, don't save, don't get married. Those are means tests.
I see.
If you have an able-bodied worker in a household,
have a child, get an abortion.
Qualify for certain benefits. If you work in those poor households, you are not going to qualify for certain benefits. If you have any savings, you are not going to qualify for certain benefits. So you have to drain your life. Now, for people that come in with nothing, you come in with nothing, but you will never have anything. There's no ownership in a housing project. There's no ownership in anything. And especially if you're now even dependent on government for transportation, if you then say, well, maybe I should go to school,
and they want you to buy an electric car.
Now, we changed some of those rules during the 90s under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, and Bill Clinton signed welfare reform into law after 60 years of having it just that way. But it's still very difficult. I worked as a consultant on that project, but it's difficult because a lot of the bluer states don't like those rules. They don't want work requirements. They don't want time limits. So they change the rules a little bit. They make things a little bit more flexible for people to just stay trapped in government.
Is it because they feel like it's, being too hard on the people? What is the thinking?
It's interesting you would ask that question. In this particular tome, The State of Black Progress, Judge Janice Rogers Brown looked at that very question of a natural law. Do we believe people have the capacity to self-govern? So I think that there's this insistence of the elite that there are certain people that just cannot manage their own lives. They don't have the capacity. They're looking through their own lens to say what they're not rocket
can't get an
therefore they
ID.
have nothing to contribute. And so it's almost like it's a demeaning outlook on life for the poor and those amongst us that maybe started with less. So it's a question for all of our society if we're going to do anything about these entitlement programs and our social safety net programs that are totally draining and killing our country. If we're going to do anything about it, the first question is, do we think they have the capacity? Can they do something? Can any child learn to read, for instance? Why is it that so many fourth graders that are trapped in these zip codes where nothing works except government, why can't they read? Why is it that other fourth graders can read? And it doesn't matter what ethnic background you're from, even though these social engineering programs have disproportionately hurt Black people. They've hurt Black people because Black people came out of slavery through Jim Crow to a welfare state. And so this is a very challenging decision that people have to make. Do I try to get something, or do I live off the promises of government. So that would be the first question people have to ask. Do you believe that people have the ability to self-govern? Do you believe that people have the capacity to do anything, just anything? And if we do, then we would be more benevolent when it comes to our own personal interests and our own personal passions than to try to build out one-size-fits-all government programs or let them just continue to feed off of themselves, which is not only draining the budget, it's draining the human capacity of those very individuals that we keep saying we want to help. We should have flexibility and mobility, and the only way to do that is to move all of these so-called safety net programs to the states. Let them decide. Let's build our community based on location, as opposed to one size fits all from here in Washington, where 7 out of $10 that comes in here goes out immediately to a person through a program.
Because then I guess you're suggesting that you could see the impact. Right?
Well, you'll see the impact, and you'll know. Yeah, you'll not only see the impact, you can come if it's working at all. I mean, look at this monster of HUD. Most people don't even know what it does, and we have to ask ourselves: is it working? Look what happened in homelessness. When homelessness was over at HHS, Health and Human Services, which is, if you believe that homelessness is a human problem, then that's where it belongs. But when Barack Obama came to town, he believed it was a housing problem, so he moved the budget to HUD. And the budget's unbelievable, and it's destroying entire populations of cities. So you can't have a program that just says they all just need a place to live. You have to know, no, some are really drug addicted, some are alcoholics, some are economically distressed, but others have mental incapacitation, some are just lost. So we have to be able to segment that way, and that's only the best place to do that is very, very local and very, very private through our charity programs.
First program
A
didn't
little
work.
bit more about your background. I'd like to kind of recap that for our viewers who haven't been with us as long.
Well, I came to a lot of these ideas just because of my own personal experiences and bad choices that I was making after believing the lies of the left all through my junior years and my, I guess, from preteen and teenage years, that America was racist, I shouldn't mainstream, that my problems were somebody else's fault, that I was poor because others were wealthy. And when you keep hearing this over and over and over again, you tend to believe it. And so you just kind of distance yourself from any type of desire for better, desire for purpose, desire for any kind of meaning in your life. So I just got caught up in everything. Reckless living, you name it. Criminal activity, drug activity, sexual activity, abortion activity, welfare activity. And then God saved me. I was going to get I was trying to subsidize my welfare check, and I walked into this business trying to go get a little job where they would just pay me under the table so that I didn't have to tell my caseworker because if she found out, then I would get penalized. So I wasn't making anything. I was just working instead of watching TV. And so who wants to do that? So I was hoping that they would, give me a little money under the table, and they didn't. Instead, they introduced me to the Lord, and that was the best decision I could have made to start refocusing on myself, to be responsible with the choices that I was making, to believe that I really did have the capacity to self-govern, that I have agency, that I have destiny. And once you start believing that and you start investing in that part of everybody's life, you'll start seeing growth. And it doesn't matter whether you're a homeless person, former drug person seeing it. The first way that you solve a problem is admit you have one. And that's something government can't do for somebody. And we don't want them to. Government is to protect our interests, not to plunder our interests, and not to pick winners and losers about those interests.
Well, Star, any final thoughts as we finish?
Well, I'm trying to think of everything that we said in our tone, but it's a really thick book, so I'm hoping everybody will go out and get it, because I think that it's important, especially people looking in. From outside of a community of people and looking in, to where this discussion has always come from the left to say how we should think about the journey of African Americans. We have many a holiday, we have many of everything, we have many of that, many of this, and it's good to hear the alternative side. When you hear that there's another position, it will help build more continuity in our society, I believe, because then people will look at their neighbor very differently, or look at our inner cities very differently, to think maybe we can fix it. And that's what I want, a better attitude about helping people help themselves.
So, Star Parker, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here with you.
Thank you all for joining Star Parker and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Yanya Kellick.